The flood left 50 tons of tangled black wood blocking her lower pasture completely. Mo saw a devastating nightmare. She saw a rare black walnut burrowed by water. The county man arrived with an aluminum clipboard and a $75 per ton disposal quote. She said 4 words. Then she picked up the saw. The mud sucked at her boots when she shifted her weight. And she didn't shift it much. Fern Locklear stood at the bottom of the lower pasture at 6 in the morning with her grandfather's draw knife hanging loose in her right hand. The hickory handle was still dark from 50 years of his palm oil. She was 24 years old, and she wore a worn red and cream plaid flannel button-up under a weathered tan canvas farm jacket with a darker brown hood and lining softened by years of use. Her faded medium blue jeans were dust-worn at the thighs and knees. Her medium brown hair with warm chestnut and sun-lightened golden undertones was parted near the center and pulled back into a loose, practical low ponytail with several wispy strands falling around her forehead, temples, and cheeks. She had large, light blue-gray eyes and freckles across the bridge of her nose. The morning cold made her breath show in front of her mouth, and she didn't move it. She looked at what the creek had done. 50 tons. That's what Rockcastle County would eventually call it on paper. What it looked like was the inside of a wrecked ship. Trunks stacked crossways over each other in a jam 80 feet wide. Root balls the size of cars jutting up at angles. Black silt drying in cracked plates over everything, so the whole pile looked like it had been dragged out of a coal seam. Water still ran under it somewhere. A low gurgle you could feel through the ground more than hear. 3 days of rain did it. April of 1987. The kind of rain that doesn't come in bursts, but just sets in like a tenant who isn't leaving. The gauge on the barn post overflowed at 9 inches, and she quit checking. On the second night, Skaggs Creek came out of its bank a quarter-mile upstream, where the old railroad grade pinched it, and it went looking for somewhere to put 50 years of drowned timber. It found her pasture. It backed up against the fence line, tore out 400 feet of woven wire, and stacked everything it had been carrying since Lord knows when into a plug that ran from the culvert clear to the sycamore. She'd owned the place 14 months, 140 acres, most of it hillside, 20 of it decent bottom that had just become a log yard, a barn with a sagging east wall, a 20-inch bandsaw under a tarp 3 phase older than she was that Everett Locklear had bought at an auction in Somerset and never once explained why, and 11 notebooks. That was the inheritance. No cash. There had been $1,800 in a coffee can, and she'd spent it on the roof. Everett had been dead 14 months, and she still caught herself saving things to tell him. By 8, the neighbors started coming. Not to help. Kentucky's like that. A flood is entertainment if it lands on the other fellow's ground. Trucks slowed at the top of the lane, idled, moved on. Some of them backed up for a second look. A green Ford stopped at the fence line with 2 men in it, and one of them leaned out the window with his elbow on the door and laughed loud enough to carry 200 yards downhill. "Hell of a woodpile, honey. You going to sell it as kindling?" Fern didn't turn around. That's worth sitting with. She heard it. She just didn't have anything to spend on him. She adjusted her grip on the drawn knife, tugged the collar of the canvas jacket up against the wind, and started walking the length of the jam. Here's what she was doing, and nobody at the fence line understood it. She was counting. She counted root balls first, 19 of them, which meant 19 trees that had come out of a bank hole roots and all torn loose by a creek that had been eating that upstream bend since before her grandfather was born. Then she counted cut ends. That's the tell. A cut end is flat and square, and it means a human being once put a saw to that tree. She found 31. 31 logs somebody had felled, bucked, and lost. Off a wagon, off a splash dam, off a railroad siding when the timber runs came through this county in the 20s and 30s, and men floated logs down to the mills at high water and lost a third of them every single trip. Losers. Sunk logs, 60 years, sitting in cold creek water with no oxygen, which is the one place on this earth where wood does not rot. She stopped at the 4th log from the sycamore end. The bark was gone, and where the jam had ground two trunks together, something had scraped through the silk crust to the wood underneath. She got a thumbnail in, and it didn't give. She got the draw knife in and pulled one thin curl off it, maybe 6 inches long. And the shaving came away, and the fresh face underneath was chocolate brown. Not gray, not punky, dark, oily purple brown with a ripple in the grain where a limb had been. Black walnut. And that ripple meant burl. She stood there in the mud holding a wet shaving between two fingers, turning it in the light. And she did not smile, because farm women don't smile at the beginning of anything. But her heart went sideways. 50 years underwater does something to walnut nobody has figured out how to fake. Minerals migrate into the cell walls. The color goes deep, and even instead of streaky, the wood stabilizes, stops fighting itself, stops moving with the weather. Furniture men in North Carolina paid stupid money for it and mostly couldn't get it because you have to find it first. And finding it usually means it's in a river. Hers was on land now. Her land. Stacked 80 feet wide and about 11 feet high. She walked back up to the house with her jeans soaked to the knee boots slopping, and she sat at the kitchen table without taking the jacket off. The 11 notebooks were in a Sunbeam bread box on top of the ice box because Everett said paper keeps better where the mice can't reason with it. She pulled the second one. That's when the math started, and the math was ugly. She had no skidder, no dozer, no winch truck. There was no road to the creek, never had been, because Everett had run cattle down there, and cattle don't need a road. The nearest place a loaded truck could turn around was 600 feet uphill through a soft field that wouldn't hold a bicycle until July. She had $410 in the account at Farmer's Deposit. The bandsaw hadn't been wired in 9 years. $50,000 of wood, maybe more. And no way on God's earth to touch a single stick of it. She opened the second journal to the flyleaf where her grandfather had written one line in pencil, pressing hard the way he did. What the water keeps the world calls lost. She read it 3 times. She had read it maybe 40 times in her life. It had never meant anything much before. It was just a sentence Everett wrote at the top of a notebook the year the well went bad. That morning at 7:12 in Rockcastle County, Kentucky in April of 1987. It meant something. Morning came up gray over the creek bottom, and the sound that broke it was tires on gravel. A county truck rolling up the lane with its headlights still on, slow like the man behind the wheel wanted her to hear him coming. Colston Truitt stepped down with his aluminum clipboard already in his hand. I was 56 years old, rimless glasses with silver arms, steel gray hair parted like he'd measured it with a rule. Pressed navy quarter zip pullover with the county land management seal on the left breast. Tan dress boots that he had chosen for a farm road, which tells you exactly how much dirt he expected to touch. He'd printed the quote before he ever saw the property. Think about that for a second. He'd already decided what her land was worth before he laid eyes on a single log. Fern came off the porch in the canvas jacket ponytail loose over one shoulder. The brass folding rule was clipped to her belt loop the way it had hung on her grandfather for 40 years. She stopped 10 feet out and stood there, hands loose at her sides. "Miss Locklear." He smiled. It was a good smile. That's the thing about men like Colston. The cruelty never arrives with a raised voice. It arrives at room temperature with a handshake in a form. "I'll make this easy on you. What you've got laying in that bottom is a hazard. Storm debris, tangled timber, 50-some down trees." He tilted the clipboard so she could see the schedule underneath. "County's willing to help. Burn permits already approved on my end. I bring an excavator crew and we windrow the whole mess torch. What will burn, haul the rest. $75 a ton disposal. Call it 50 ton. You're clean by August." Clean. He said it like the land had a disease. She didn't answer. He kept going because men like Colston fill silence the way water fills a hole. "I understand this place meant something to your granddad. Sentiment's fine. Sentiment doesn't cut hay, and it sure doesn't pay taxes." He looked past her at the barn, the sagging fence, the mud. Honestly, a girl your age out here alone, you'd be doing yourself a favor. Take the clean lot, put it in fescue, lease it to somebody who knows what they're doing. Old man Everett never made a dime off this ground, and he had 51 years to try. There it is, right there. I wasn't just selling a service. He was telling a 24-year-old woman that her grandfather had been a joke, that she was a smaller joke, and that the kindest thing the county could do was scrape the whole embarrassment flat and let a real farmer have it. Fern's face didn't move. The light blue-gray eyes stayed exactly where they were. She asked one question. Who keeps the wood? Colston's chin came up half an inch. He hooked a thumb in his belt. Salvage rights go with the contractor. Standard. Anything millable, we handle the offtake. Keeps your costs down. And there was the whole game laid out in 11 words. Let me spell it out, because he sure wasn't going to. He was going to charge her $3,750 to remove trees from her own land, and then take the trees. She pays him to haul off her property, and he sells her property, and he keeps the check. That's not a disposal service. That's a man walking into your house, charging you rent, and leaving with the furniture. Keeps my costs down, Fern said. Flat, not a question. That's right. He handed her the quote. Sign at the bottom. I'll have a crew here Thursday. She took the paper. She turned it over. And on the back of Colston Truett's own printed disposal schedule, standing in the mud in her worn knee jeans, she did the arithmetic in pencil. 50 tons at 75. 3,750. Out of a checking account with 410 in it. Then the other column. 51 logs in the bottom. White oak, red oak, and 11 walnut. The walnut that Everett had planted himself in 1945 along the fence line. 42 years in the ground. Even at bottom dollar veneer prices, sound butt logs, quarter sawn, the numbers came out somewhere near 50,000. She was being asked to pay 3,750 to destroy 50,000. Have you ever had somebody smile at you while trying to take everything you had and count on you being too dumb to check the math? She checked the math. Fern folded the quote once and looked up at him. The timber stays here. 4 words. That was all she gave him. Colston blinked behind the rimless lenses. He waited for the rest of it. The apology, the explanation, the nervous laugh that lets a man like him keep talking. It didn't come. She just stood there, square-shouldered still, while a hen came around the corner of the barn and pecked at his polished boot. You'll be calling me by winter, he said, and the smile had gone thin. That wood will be punk and full of beetles by then, and you'll be paying double to haul rot. He set the quote on the fence post going out, pinned under a rock, the way you would leave a bill for somebody you expected to come crawling. The truck backed down the lane. The dust hung and settled. The county heard about it before supper. That's how it works out there. A road grader operator tells a woman at the feed store, and the feed store tells the church. By the next afternoon, Fern Locklear was the girl who told the county no, sitting on 50 rotting trees and $1,100, too proud to take help. Lorraine Beckett heard it at the co-op with her chipped enamel mug in her hand and didn't say a word either way, which in that county counted as loyalty. She was 67 years old, a widow, 11 years mustard yellow, quilted vest, zipped to the chin, gold wire rims on her nose. Her husband had run a 2-man sawmill down by Livingston until his back went in '79. She had watched him dry oak in the shed for 3 years before he sold his first board. She knew what silence looked like when it was work. She heard the men laughing at the counter. She looked at the men. She looked at her coffee. She did not tell them to hush. She just remembered. Fern spent the evening at the kitchen table with the lamp on and the second journal open. Everett's handwriting was small and squared off, and the pages from 1964 through 1971 were nothing but drying schedules. Air dry 1 year per inch of thickness, stickered, 1-inch spacers, sealed with wax or the checking runs 18 inches up the log. Walnut wants shade the first summer, or it goes gray and dead-faced. Oak dries slow, or it honeycombs from the inside, where you can't see it until the saw finds it. And then halfway down a page dated April 1969, underlined twice, figured grain hides in the crotch and the stump. Everybody burns the ugly wood. That's why it's cheap. She read it 3 times. Then she pulled a clean sheet of paper toward her and started a list of 51 logs. October water in that creek runs about 48 degrees, which is cold enough to make your shins ache in 10 minutes, and stupid enough to make your legs stop reporting in after 20. Fern went in anyway. Boots laced tight, jeans soaked black to the thigh, the thick medium brown ponytail pinned up under her collar so it wouldn't drag. Hatchet in her right hand and the brass-cased folding rule clipped at her belt loop where it always rode. 51 logs in that jam. She meant to know every one of them before she pulled a single stick. Here's how you rid a drowned log. You don't trust the outside. Sunk timber wears a gray felt of silt and algae that makes walnut look like ash, and ash look like garbage. So you chip. One clean hatchet bite thumb deep, a window about the size of a playing card down through the weathered skin into the living wood underneath. Then you look, and you smell. Walnut comes up chocolate, almost purple at the heart, and it smells faintly like a spice cabinet somebody left open. Cherry runs pinkish tan and goes red-brown as it meets the air, and it smells sweet, nearly like fruit, which sounds made up until you've had your nose 2 inches from a fresh chip. Ash is pale straw with grain lines you could measure with a ruler, dead straight and boring in the best way. Hackberry stinks. Sycamore smells like wet paper. She marked each log with a lumber crayon, WCA and a number. By the 11th log, she had started adding a second mark, a small star. When the test chip showed grain that didn't run straight, but wandered, curled, doubled back on itself like water going around a stone. Figure. The thing furniture people pay stupid money for and sawmills call a defect. Log 31 got 3 stars, butternut and enormous. She pasted at 31 feet with a trunk swell near the base. She couldn't get her arms halfway around. The chip came out the color of light honey with a shimmer under it that moved when she turned her wrist. Now the pile. This is where people die. And Fern knew it because Everett had written it down in that flat block print of his. A log jam is a building. Somewhere in it is a keystone. Cut the keystone and the building falls on you. Water pushes. 50 logs stacked against each other in a bend have been pushing for years. And that force doesn't just sit there. It travels through the pile along contact points log to log until it dead ends on 2 or 3 pieces that are carrying the whole load. Those are your keystones. They are usually low, usually buried, and they always look like the easiest thing to grab. Pull 1 and 4 tons of hardwood rolls at once into water with your legs in it. So she started at the top and worked down, and she never once cut a log that had another log resting on it. No skidder, no tractor. A hand come along rated at 2 tons, a snatch block, and a chain choker. The snatch block is the whole trick. Run your cable out to the log back through a pulley anchored on a sycamore across the bank and back to the winch, and you have doubled your pulling power while having your speed. Physics doesn't care that you are one woman with a $50 hand winch. It just does the math. 4 logs a day. That was the number. Crank, reset, crank, reset. The ratchet handle clacking, the cable singing when it took the load. That long, slow grind of wet wood dragging up a mud bank. 4 a day, October into November. Fingers cracked at the knuckles and forearms burning by noon. And the butt swells, the fat lumpy sections at the base of the walnuts, the ones the mill would have bucked off and thrown in the burn pile. She stacked separate, up on skids, out of the mud, because those were burls. A burl is the tree's scar tissue. Something goes wrong. An insect boring, a fungal infection, an injury, a fire scar, and the tree responds by throwing out a mass of buds that never open. Thousands of them crowded each one trying to become a branch and getting nowhere. All of it wrapped in wood year after year until you have got a lump on the trunk that looks like a tumor and mills like a fever dream. There is no grain direction in there. It swirls eyes and knots and ripples running in every direction at once, which makes it a nightmare to cut in the single most valuable figure in North American hardwood, and the river. This is the part that ought to sound backwards. The river saved them. Wood doesn't rot from water. It rots from fungus. And fungus needs oxygen. Sink a log in cold, low oxygen sediment, heavy creek water, and you have built a fungus-proof vault. The water pushes into the cell walls. The tannins leach and darken. The minerals in the silt seep in. And after 11, 12, 20 years down there, you pull out wood that is denser and darker than anything standing in the woods above it. What the water keeps the world calls lost. 22 logs on the bank by the second week of November. She was ready to cut. The mill was Everett's old bandsaw, a 1971 unit under a shed roof with a 20-inch wheel and a blade she had sharpened by hand 3 times. She picked a cherry log, 13 inches at the small end. No burl, nothing precious. A test piece. The first slab came off at 8/4, 2 full inches, and it was beautiful. Wet dark red streaked with mineral gray from 20 years in silt. She ran her thumb across the face and it came away damp. 3 more slabs. She stacked them flat on the concrete pad behind the shed out of the rain, under the shed roof where the November wind came through clean and steady all day and all night. That was the mistake. Green wood sits at something like 80% moisture. Dry the outside faster than the inside can follow, and the surface shrinks against a core that hasn't shrunk yet. And the wood does the only thing it can do. It tears itself apart along the rays. 4 days in, she heard the first one go. A sound like a knuckle cracking from 30 feet away. By day 7, all 4 slabs had split end to end. $800 of cherry opened like a book nobody would ever pay to read. She does not panic. She kneels on the sawdust with her knees in the cold and unclips the brass folding rule from her belt loop, and she runs it along the crack in the widest slab, following the split from the end grain inward, like she is tracking an animal. 11 inches. She writes it on the back of her hand in pencil. The next slab. 14. The third, 9.5. The 4th split clean through a knot and kept going. All 4 cracks start at the ends, every single one. That is not a wood problem. That is a physics problem. And she knows it the second she sees the pattern, because water leaves a board through the open straws of the end grain, something like 10 or 12 times faster than it leaves through the face. The ends dry, shrink, pull. The middle stays fat and wet and stubborn. Something has to tear, and the ends are always what tears. Her grandfather knew that 50 years before she was born. She finds it that night working backward through the journals with a flashlight, because the barn wiring is still half a rat's nest. Page 141 in Everett Locklear's cramped block letters. Seal the ends or lose the board. Below it, a smear of something waxy that had soaked into the paper and gone translucent. And a recipe. Paraffin. Cut with a little beeswax. Melted low. Brushed hot on the fresh end grain within an hour of the cut. Under that, underlined twice. 1 inch per year. Air not heat. 1 inch per year. Her slabs are 1.5 inches thick. 18 months. That is the sentence. 18 months of wood doing nothing but sitting in the dark, breathing out water, at a rate she cannot rush while she has $41 in a coffee can in a truck that needs a battery. Have you ever had the answer land in your lap and realize the answer cost more than the problem did? She builds the stack anyway. That is who she is. The base goes down first because a drying stack is only as straight as the ground under it. She levels 6 pressure-treated runners on concrete blocks, checking each one with a line and a bubble shimming until nothing rocks. Any dip in that base transfers into every board above it. And a board that dries with a bow in it is a board that stays bowed forever. Wood remembers the shape you let it take. Then the stickers. 3/4-inch strips, ripped dead uniform out of dry scrap, laid crosswise every 16 inches, and every sticker and every layer stacked directly over the one below it, so the weight runs down in straight columns to the ground. Miss that alignment and the load sags into the gaps and you get waves. 3/4 inch is not a random number either. Too thin in the air stalls between the layers and mold blooms, gray across the sapwood. Too thick and the outside faces dry too fast, and you are right back to checking. Over the top, she screws down a sheet of corrugated tin weighted with cinder blocks with a 6-inch air gap under it. Sun off the top layer, rain off everything. And the sides she leaves wide open, all four of them, because the whole system runs on moving air and nothing else. No fans, no heat, no shortcut. She stands back and looks at it, and it is the ugliest thing on the property, and it is the only thing on the property that is working. Here is the math that nobody talks about in stories like this. Green slabs sell, not for much, $60 a piece to a guy with a shop and a planer who will take on the risk himself. She had, by her own count in the ledger, 116 usable slabs come off that mill. That is $6,000 sitting in the yard right now in a winter where she needs about 800 just to keep the lights on and the propane flowing. Dried and stable, those same slabs are worth 400 each, but she has to live 18 months to find out. She sells nothing. She seals every end and stacks every board and walks away from $6,000 because her grandfather wrote 1 inch per year in a notebook, and she believes a dead man over her own hunger. That is the hardest arithmetic in this entire story, and she does it on a Tuesday with frost on the tin. Lorraine Beckett comes to the fence line 4 days later. She has got the chipped enamel mug in one hand and a thermos in the other. Mustard yellow quilted vest zipped to the chin. Green rubber boots sunk 2 inches in the mud. And she does not say a word about the stack. She does not ask what it cost. She does not do the thing everybody in that county has been doing since the trucks came, which is smile with their mouths and laugh with their eyes. She just pours a second cup and holds it over the wire. Fern takes it. The ponytail comes half loose at the temples, and there is wax under her fingernails, and she has been awake since 4. They stand there in the cold. 2 women looking at a pile of lumber saying nothing. My husband dried oak, Lorraine says finally. Took forever. He was insufferable about it. Fern drinks the coffee. It's the ends, she says. You seal the ends. That is the whole conversation. It is also the first time in 9 months anybody on that road has spoken to her like she knows something. Now here is where the story has to reach back a little. Because to understand what Fern was doing in that pasture with a draw knife at 6 in the morning, you have to understand the 3 graves at the top of the North Field. The first one is dated 1898. Wade Locklear, 27 years old, came up out of Blount County, Tennessee, with a wagon and a wife and a mule, and paid $140 for 140 acres in Rock Castle County, Kentucky, in the summer of 1891. Then he broke his back to keep it. He is buried where the Walnut fence line ends now under a hand-carved sandstone marker with just his name and the years. Beside him, dated 1971, is Deacon Locklear, Fern's father. Deacon was 33 years old the summer he died. He had bought a used John Deere 4500 at auction over in Somerset that spring. Never was much of a machine hand. The header got hung up on a lodge strip of Kentucky bluegrass on an August Tuesday, and he climbed down to clear it with the deck still engaged. Fern was 8. She was in the yard hauling a plastic bucket of water toward the chickens when she heard her mother scream. She remembered the bucket more than anything else, the way it went cold across her leg when she dropped it. Her mother in the pale house dress running across the yard toward the field. Everett coming out of the barn in his coveralls and the walk turning into a run. They did not let her see him. She was told he had gone to sleep and would not wake up, which is what people used to tell children in 1971 and probably nowhere else in the country outside of a farm in Rock Castle County, Kentucky. The third grave is a headstone with no body under it. Fern's mother, Odette Locklear, left in September of 1972. Took the Buick. Took a suitcase. left a note on the icebox that said, "I am not made for this. I am sorry. I am not made for this." She never came back. Everett filed the paperwork himself 2 years later when a lawyer in Lexington told him what he had to do. Placed a marker beside Deacon that said Odette Locklear, born dash missing. He never had it changed. Fern was 9 when Odette went. She moved into Everett's back bedroom with a pillowcase full of her clothes and never left. He raised her the way a man raises a barn cat. Fed her, kept her warm, let her follow him. Did not talk more than he had to, which turned out to be exactly the kind of raising that produces a woman who can stand square-shouldered in front of a county man in polished boots and not blink. She followed Everett everywhere, under the tractor, into the barn, down to the mill shed where the 20-inch bandsaw stood. And on Sundays when the weather kept them inside up the north field to the graves, where she watched him sit on the grass with his back against the sandstone and drink his coffee cold from a mason jar because he had forgotten to fill the thermos. She was not raised to be pretty, she was raised to pay attention. She learned to sharpen a chainsaw by watching him do it 14 times without saying a word. She learned to read the sky for a spring storm by standing beside him on the porch while he watched the light change over the pin oaks. She learned to keep her mouth shut in a room where men were talking about things they did not know as much as they thought they did. And she learned to write things down. That was the notebook rule. Everett kept 11 of them spiral-bound feed store cheap. And when Fern was 12, he gave her a green Field and Stream pocketbook at Christmas and told her plain as an order to start her own. Their cattle prices, what time the pin oaks turned, what the frogs sounded like in April, anything worth remembering, because paper remembers longer than people do. That was the other line he wrote at the top of the ledger, the one that lives on page 1 of every book he ever kept. Paper remembers longer than people do. Everett died on a Tuesday in February of 1986, sitting in the kitchen chair with a coffee cup in his hand and the morning paper open across the oilcloth. Heart just quit. He was 79. The paper said the state was going to raise the sales tax on farm equipment. He had underlined it twice and put a question mark in the margin. Fern was 22 years old. She buried him beside Deacon up under the walnut he had planted himself in 1945. She did not cry at the graveside. She had not cried when her father died, and she had not cried when her mother left, and she was not going to start on the day she put her grandfather in the ground. She cried later, in the barn, alone, with one hand against the flank of the milking cow because the cow was warm and did not ask questions. She read the notebooks that first winter, all 11. Cover to cover, she got 14 months in before the flood came. Now back to the barn. Winter comes in hard, and the thing that keeps her alive isn't the slabs, it's the garbage. Every crooked limb, every crotch, every not-rotten section that Colston Truett's crews would have thrown into the burn heaps as unfit for anything. She bucks into 16-inch rounds and splits by hand with a maul until her forearms ache and her palms crack open at the base of each finger. She stacks it in face cords along the driveway. $45 a rick delivered, and she delivers it herself in a truck with a jump-started battery and a heater that only blows cold. 211 ricks that winter. She eats on limbs the county paid to get rid of. The truck that pulls up on a Wednesday morning in early December is not a customer. It is Barrett Halston. Barrett is 71, retired sawyer. Lives 4 miles north up Route 461 in a house he built himself in 1963. He is thin at the shoulders now, but the hands are the hands of a man who spent 40 years feeding hardwood into a mill. Big knuckles, a thumb that does not straighten anymore from the day a green oak butt kicked back on him in the winter of '78. He knew Everett. They had cut Walnut together on the Sinclair place in the fall of '67. He drives up the lane in a 1971 Chevy Stepside that is more Bondo than steel at this point. He does not get out. He rolls down the window. He looks at the stack of drying slabs under the shed roof for a long minute. He looks at the wax pot on the camp burner beside the stack. He looks at Fern in the canvas jacket with the wax brush in her hand. He nods once. Your stickers is even. Just that. She looks at him. Granddad taught me. He looks at the stack again. He rubs his jaw with the crooked thumb. He would. He rolls the window up. He backs down the lane. He drives. That is the whole visit. She stands there watching his taillights go, and she does not know it yet, but she has just been visited by the only man in 3 counties who could have looked at her stack and known at a glance whether she was going to make it. He had known. He would not tell her for another 16 months. That night, she sits at the kitchen table with the wax cooling on the stove and the 11th notebook open in front of her. She has been reading them straight through, one after another, from the year Everett came home from the war to the last entry the winter before he died. And in the 11th notebook in the back on a page dated April 1971, she finds a paragraph she has read before, but has not until this exact night understood. Deacon killed today, combine header, bluegrass jam. Then underneath, in a slower hand like the pencil had gone tired between one sentence and the next. He was going to help me cut the walnut this fall. Never got to it. Somebody ought to. Somebody ought to. She closes the notebook. She sits with her hands flat on the oilcloth, and she looks out the kitchen window at the pin oaks along the driveway. And the wind moves them in the cold, and the porch light catches the last leaves that had not fallen yet. And she thinks about a man she barely remembers who had planned to cut walnut with his father the fall after he died. And the walnut that had stood in that fence line for 42 years since. And the 11 black walnut logs that were right that minute sitting on skids under a shed roof, 600 feet from her window, waiting on 18 months of patience she was not yet sure she had. She goes to the shed with a flashlight. The cedar walnut box sits on the top shelf, about the size of a family Bible. Small brass padlock on the front. No key. She has walked past it 400 times since the funeral and never once really seen it. She sees it now. She stands on a milk crate and gets it down. She turns it over in her hands. She can feel something shift inside. Not heavy, not liquid. Something like a small book and a smaller thing beside it. She looks at every drawer in Everett's workbench, every coffee tin, every peg on the pegboard, every jar on the sill, every hook on the ring by the door. There is no key in that shed that would open that lock. She sets the walnut box back on the top shelf. She stands there a while with her hand on it. Then she goes back to the house. She does not sleep that night. She sits at the kitchen table with the second notebook open and reads the same page 11 times. Waste is a decision you make about a thing before you have looked at it twice. That is what Everett wrote in 1964, below the sentence about the potatoes, beside the sentence about the ends and the wax. She reads it 11 times, then she gets up in the dark. She puts her boots on. She goes out to the shed and she stands in front of the stack of drying slabs under the tin roof. She lays her palm flat on the end grain of the widest one. The wood is cold. It takes the heat from her hand and does not give it back. Somewhere out in the pasture, a fox calls once sharp and thin against the frost. She stands there a long time. Then she says one thing out loud into the dark to nobody at all. She says, I hear you. And she goes back to the house. 2 months later, in the last week of January, the letter comes. It comes in a plain white envelope with the return address of Farmers Deposit Bank in Somerset. Delmar Stedman Ag Loan Desk. She stands at the mailbox at the end of Cane Ridge Road with the envelope in her hand and the wind moving in the pin oaks along the fence, and she does not open it there. She walks the 600 feet up the lane with the envelope in her jacket pocket and does not touch it. She opens it at the kitchen table under the 60-watt bulb. $40,000, 6.8%. 5-year term, secured against the 81 acres of the North Hill. First payment due in 90 days. Enough to fill the propane. Enough to pay the taxes. Enough if she wanted to buy a proper dehumidification kiln and shortcut the 18 months her grandfather had written in the margin. Enough if one season went sideways to hand a bank the deed to ground her grandfather had bought with 41 years of his back. She sets the letter on the oilcloth. She sits with it for a long time. Then she goes to the shelf by the stove and brings back the second notebook. And she opens it to the flyleaf. And she reads the sentence one more time. What the water keeps, the world calls lost. And under it, the smaller sentence that Everett wrote in the second summer after Deacon died. In pencil so light she has to hold the page toward the lamp to read it. Somebody ought to. She closes the notebook. She folds the letter once. She puts it in the drawer beside the icebox. Not the trash, just the drawer. Not yet. The wind moves in the sycamores along the creek, and somewhere down the pasture, a screech owl calls once and does not call again. And in the shed under a shed roof 600 feet from the kitchen window, 116 slabs of end-sealed hardwood keep quietly and without ceremony, giving up their water at a rate no banknote in Somerset could ever hurry. February came in with a cold snap that dropped the water in the mason jar on the kitchen windowsill down to a rim of ice by morning. The propane tank out behind the house read 11%, which in a Kentucky February is not a number, it is a countdown. Fern Locklear stood at the kitchen window at 4:30 in the morning with a cup of coffee she had made with the last of the grounds in the tin. She looked out at the driveway where the 211 ricks of firewood she had split by hand had gone down to 87, which meant the ricks had been moving, and which also meant she had been driving them out one truckload at a time to porches and back doors from Livingston to Mount Vernon in a truck that only had heat if you kept the RPMs above 2,000, which she did. $45 a rick, delivered. That was the whole winter. She had $890 in the account at Farmer's Deposit that morning. She had $36 in cash in the mason jar on the mantel. She had the loan letter in the drawer beside the icebox where she had put it in January. She had not signed it. The stack was still under the shed roof. She had gone out at midnight the night before in the cold with a flashlight and a moisture meter she had bought used out of a classified in the back of Fine Woodworking magazine for $29. 2 pins, a needle gauge. She had pushed the pins into the end grain of the third slab from the bottom of the stack. She had held the light on the gauge. The needle had settled and held. 42%. That was down from 63 the week the wax went on. She wrote it in the ledger. She wrote the date and the time. She wrote the temperature at the porch thermometer, which read 21 Fahrenheit. She wrote wind north light. She closed the ledger. She went back inside. She did not tell anybody. Because here is what nobody in Rockcastle County understood about that stack of drying slabs and what Colston Truett's aluminum clipboard was never going to record. Wood drying is a chemical event. It looks like nothing. It looks exactly like doing nothing, which is precisely why every man who drove past that shed felt entitled to laugh. But behind the wood in the cell walls, the free water was leaving through the open capillaries of the end grain. And after the free water, the bound water was going to start leaving the cell walls themselves. And when the bound water left, the wood would begin to shrink. Not evenly. Twice as fast tangentially as radially. Which is why Everett had written in the 8th Journal that a stack drying in Kentucky needed weight on top of it, to make the shrinking argue with itself and lose. She had 120 cinder blocks on top of the stack. She kept adding them. Every Sunday morning after coffee, she walked out to the shed and pushed the pins into a different slab, and she wrote the number in the ledger. 63, 59, 52, 48, 42. She was not selling anything. That was the arithmetic she was still doing at 4:30 on that February morning. She could have sold every one of those 116 slabs green. $40 each to a shop in Berea. $60 each to a hobbyist with a planer and a garage in Louisville. $6,000 sitting in the yard. Right that minute. In a winter where she had $36 in a mason jar, she would not. Because green wood sells like green tomatoes. Fine to eat, but not what a customer is buying. And she had decided, standing in her kitchen in October with her jeans still wet from the creek, that she was not going to be a supplier of tonnage, competing with mills that own trains. She was going to sell small. She was going to sell rare. She was going to sell direct to the makers, which meant she had to wait. which meant right now in February in a Kentucky winter with the propane at 11%, she had to eat something. The truck that came up the lane at 9 that morning was Delmar Stedman's. Delmar was 54 years old, silver-rimmed glasses like Colston's, but rounder brown corduroy sport coat over a gray sweater thin at the wrist and thick through the middle. He had been at the Farmers Deposit Bank in Somerset for 31 years. He was a Rockcastle County boy. His mother had bought her eggs from Everett in the 1950s. He drove up the lane slow. He stepped down onto the gravel with his hat in one hand and a leather folio in the other. "Miss Locklear," he said. Fern was at the wood pile with the maul. She set the maul against a round of oak and walked over to the fence line and did not go past it. "Mr. Stedman." He held the folio in front of him like a preacher holds a book at a wedding. "I was in the area," he said. "I thought I'd stop and see if you had questions on the paperwork." He was lying. I had not been in the area. Somerset was 31 miles east. There was nothing between his office and her driveway but pastures and one BP station. He had driven out to see if a 24-year-old woman with no money and a stack of what he assumed was rotten timber was still holding out. The bank was at that exact moment sitting on a letter of interest from Adair County Development, LLC, a shell company that was buying up 80-acre parcels on the ridges above the highway for what everybody knew, but nobody wrote down, was future warehouse land. The going rate had gone from $600 an acre to $900 in 18 months. Her North Hill was 81 acres. At $900 an acre, that was $72,900. Adair County Development had already offered the bank $46,000 for the whole property contingent on foreclosure. If Fern Locklear signed the loan for $40,000 at 6.8% and missed a payment inside of 18 months, the bank cleared $6,900 on the difference. And the LLC, which had a post office box in Frankfurt and a lawyer whose signature Delmar had seen on 3 other closings that year, got the North Hill. None of that was on the paperwork. Delmar knew all of it. He also knew in a Kentucky farm town in 1988 that a 24-year-old woman living alone with no husband and no father was in the arithmetic of the bank a temporary problem, because either she would sign the note and default, or she would sell the whole thing at auction inside of 2 years, or she would take a job in town and marry somebody, and the deed would end up in a man's name, and the bank would refinance it. The bank had time. The bank always had time. "I've read the paperwork," Fern said. Delmar smiled the way a man smiles when he is trying to warm up a room. "Then you understand it's a fair offer." "I understand it. 6.8% is below prime, Miss Locklear. You are not going to see that number from anybody else in this county. I want you to know I fought for that number." "I appreciate that." "So." He waited. She let him wait. That is a technique she had learned from Everett. When a man is trying to get something out of you and he thinks the silence is uncomfortable for you, let the silence be uncomfortable for him. Delmar shifted his weight. He looked at the woodpile. He looked at the shed with the tin roof and the stack under it. He looked at the barn with the sagging east wall. "Nettie," he said. That was her mother's name. Her mother had used it once in the note on the icebox when she signed off. Nobody in Rockcastle County had called Fern by anything but Fern since 1972. He had done it on purpose. He had done his homework. He had gone through the county records and pulled up her birth certificate and pulled the middle name out of it, and now he was standing in her driveway using it to make her feel like he was a friend of the family. She looked at him. "Mr. Stedman," she said, "I don't have any questions on the paperwork." He nodded slow. "All right. When I do, I'll call you." He held up the folio. "You keep this." "I have my own copy." He nodded again. He put the folio back under his arm. "I'll see you," he said. "Yes, sir." He got in the truck. He backed down the lane. He drove. She watched his taillights go past the mailbox and turn onto Cane Ridge Road. Then she picked up the maul. She split oak for another 2.5 hours without stopping. And by the time she went inside, her forearms were shaking, and the palm of her right hand had cracked open at the base of the thumb again, and she had 18 more ricks stacked along the driveway. And she had not thought once about Delmar Stedman or the loan letter in the drawer. She had, however, thought about her mother, because Nettie was a small key, and she did not like the fact that Delmar had turned it. The letter from the Rockcastle County Land Management Office arrived 19 days later. It came in a 9 by 12 envelope hand, stamped in the corner, delivered by a rural carrier in a beige Ford. Fern was at the mailbox in the canvas jacket with her ponytail loose against the collar and a spool of fence wire in her right hand. She stood at the mailbox and opened the envelope with her thumbnail. Formal citation. County Land Use Code. Section 14-002. Operation of a mechanized wood milling facility in an area zoned agricultural exclusive. 60 days to cease operations, or $50 a day in accruing fines. Signed at the bottom by Colston Truitt, Director, Rockcastle County Land Management. She stood there a moment with the paper in her hand. The wind moved in the sycamores along the creek. Somewhere down the pasture, a crow called twice and did not call again. She read the citation 3 times. She looked at the signature. Then she walked back up the driveway. She sat down at the kitchen table. She laid the citation on the oilcloth. She sat with it for a long time. Here is what the citation was, and here is what it was not. What it was not was a legal instrument that any judge in Rockcastle County was ever actually going to enforce against a woman running a hand-fed bandsaw in a wax pot in her grandfather's shed. Because if that citation held, half the county would have been in violation. Every man with a chainsaw and a splitting maul on his own back 40 was by the letter of Section 14-00, operating a mechanized wood milling facility. Nobody in the office had ever cited any of them, and no county attorney was going to file the paperwork on Everett Locklear's granddaughter and have it come up in the Somerset Commonwealth Journal on a Sunday morning. What it was a message. Colston Truitt had heard through Delmar Stedman that Fern Locklear had not signed the loan, which meant she was not going to default, which meant the North Hill was not coming loose, which meant Adair County Development was going to lose an option on 81 acres of ridgeland in the next planning cycle. And Colston Truitt, who did not officially sit on the board of Adair County Development, but whose brother-in-law did, was letting her know that the county had ways to make her tired. $50 a day, 60 days, $3,000 if she waited it out. She did not have $3,000. She had $1,042 now after the winter's firewood, and an unsigned loan for $40,000 at 6.8%. She sat at the kitchen table with the citation in front of her and she thought about it. Then she got up. She put the coffee on. She poured a cup. She sat back down. She opened the second notebook. She was looking for something. She did not know exactly what. She found it 40 minutes later, in the 11th notebook, on a page dated November 1971, 3 months after Deacon had been killed, and 2 months before Odette left. In a handwriting that was tight and squared off, and in that particular entry angrier than she had ever seen from Everett. Filed the mill under a right to farm, Statute 413.072, Kentucky Code, signed at the county clerk's office in Somerset. Deed writer recorded. If they come for the shed, they come through the code first. Then underneath, underlined once, they will try. She sat there a long time. Because what Everett had done in 1971, 16 years before Fern was old enough to know what a right to farm statute was file an amendment to the deed of the property that recorded the sawmill operation as a traditional agricultural use protected under Kentucky revised statutes. Chapter 413, Section 072, which meant in language a county land management office had no way to argue with that. The mill was grandfathered into the property, in perpetuity, successor owners protected. Colston Truitt could send a citation. He could send another one after that. He could send 50 of them. Not one of them was ever going to hold up. She closed the notebook. She did not smile. She got up, put her jacket on, and drove into Somerset. The county clerk's office in Somerset was a wood-paneled room off the second floor of the courthouse staffed by a woman named Bernice Vollmer, who was 58 years old and had been at the counter since 1967. Fern walked in at 3:15 in the afternoon with the notebook under her arm. "I need the deed writer on the Locklear property," she said. "Rockcastle County, 140 acres off Cane Ridge Road. Filed November 1971. Bernice looked at her over her reading glasses. "You Everett's girl." "Yes, ma'am." Bernice pushed back from the counter. She stood up. She went to a filing cabinet at the back of the office. She was gone for about 11 minutes. When she came back, she had a manila folder in her hand and a look on her face that Fern would remember later as the first look of respect any woman over 60 had given her since Everett had died. She laid the folder on the counter. "Deed writer, signed by Everett Locklear on November 12, 1971. Notarized, filed, recorded. Section 413.072. Traditional agricultural use. Sawmill operation. In perpetuity. The original." "Copy is $1.50, Bernice said. "I'd like 3, please." Bernice made 3 copies on the machine behind the counter. She stamped each one with a certified stamp and initialed each one at the bottom. $4.50. Fern paid in ones out of the coffee tin she had brought with her. She thanked Bernice. She turned to leave. At the door, she stopped and she turned back. "Ma'am, if Colston Truitt calls up here asking whether anybody's pulled this file, would you tell him?" Bernice looked at her a long moment. Then Bernice took her reading glasses off, cleaned them on the front of her cardigan, put them back on. "Colston Truitt hasn't called this office in 9 years, she said. "I don't expect he's about to start." Fern nodded. "Thank you, ma'am. You bring your granddad's copy in here if he sends you anything else. We'll see about it." Fern nodded again. She drove home. The stack was still standing when she got back. She went to the shed with the 3 certified copies of the deed writer in a manila envelope. She put 1 copy in the envelope. She sealed the envelope. She wrote on the outside in pencil in her own hand in case something happens. She set the envelope on the top shelf of the shed, beside the walnut box with the brass padlock. She looked at the box a long moment. She did not take it down, not yet. There is a moment in a story like this one that you don't see on the outside. It happens in the kitchen at 1 in the morning. It happens with the lamp on and a woman sitting at a table with her head in her hands and nobody there to see it. For Fern Locklear, that moment came on the 2nd of March, 1988. It came because Vesper Locklear pulled up the lane at 9:10 on a Wednesday morning in a 1982 Oldsmobile Cutlass. Sierra wearing a wool coat the color of oatmeal and driving gloves the color of milk chocolate. Vesper was Fern's father's older sister's daughter. She was 45. She lived in Louisville. She was a paralegal at a firm on Market Street and had been married 19 years to a man named Curtis Barlow, who was a mid-level manager at Brown Forman. She had not been to the farm in 6 years. She got out of the Oldsmobile in the driveway in low-heeled Sunday shoes that immediately took on a coat of Kentucky mud. She stood there a moment looking around. She looked at the sagging east wall of the barn. She looked at the drying shed. She looked at the wood pile that had gone down from 211 ricks to 63. She looked at Fern's truck with the jump-started battery and the mismatched right front fender. Fern was on the porch in the canvas jacket with a coffee cup in her hand. Vesper had called the night before. Fern had known she was coming. Fern had not slept. "Fern, honey," Vesper said. "Come on inside." Vesper came up the porch steps. She stopped at the top step. She looked at Fern a long moment and her face did the thing that some women's faces do, which is arrange itself into concern that is real, but that is also at the same time a rehearsal for a speech she had already written on the drive down. "You look thin," she said. "I'm fine." Vesper came inside. She sat at the kitchen table without taking her coat off. Fern poured her a cup of coffee. Vesper wrapped both hands around it and did not drink. "I want to talk about the farm," she said. "All right." Vesper looked around the kitchen. The wood stove, the oilcloth on the table, the 11 notebooks in the Sunbeam bread box on top of the icebox, the mason jar with $36 in it on the mantel. Everett was a good man, Vesper said. Fern nodded. Good men lose farms every day, honey. That's not news. That's just what happens in a county like this to a place like this without a man on it. Fern set her own coffee down. She looked at Vesper across the oilcloth. And this is the part that ought to sit with anybody who has ever been on the receiving end of a family member who has driven a long way to save you from yourself. Because Vesper meant every word. She was not there to hurt Fern. She was there to end the thing before the bank did, which is in its own way the coldest kindness there is. Vesper reached into her handbag on the chair beside her. She pulled out a manila folder. She set it on the table between them. Curtis and I talked about it, she said. We have got a guest room set up. You'd have your own bathroom. We are within 20 minutes of 2 community colleges. You could take some classes, get a certificate in something, bookkeeping, dental hygiene, something that pays. She opened the folder. I have a card here from a realtor named Yvonne Presley. She's out of Somerset. She thinks she can move the whole property for $62,000 as is, without cleaning the flood mess, as a fixer-upper. 62 would clear the taxes and the loan you haven't signed and give you 11,000 to bring with you. Fern looked at the folder. She looked at Vesper. She looked at the folder again. Vesper reached across and touched the back of Fern's hand. Sweetie, he would not have wanted you to lose it under a bank. He would have wanted you to walk away with something. Fern did not pull her hand back. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She sat there with her hand under Vesper's, and she thought about the walnut butt log on the skid under the shed roof. She thought about a fresh chip that had come off it in October, the color of chocolate, and shimmered when she turned her wrist in the light. She thought about Everett writing in 1971, 3 months after his son died in a combine header, that if they come for the shed, they come through the code first. She thought about her mother who had left. Because she was not made for this. Fern was made for this. She had been made for this since she was 9 years old, standing at the top of the driveway, in a pillowcase full of clothes, watching her mother's Buick disappear at the bend, and knowing in a way a 9-year-old should not have to know that the only person left who was going to teach her anything was the man in the barn. She looked up at Vesper. She said, I'm not losing it, I'm learning it. Vesper opened her mouth. Fern kept going. There's a difference. And I know it doesn't look like a difference from Louisville. I know it doesn't look like a difference from the top of the driveway. I know Curtis thinks it isn't a difference. And I know Yvonne Presley thinks I'm sitting on a fixer-upper. But I'm not. I'm sitting on a mill. And the mill has been here since 1945. And it was here when my father was alive. And it was here when Everett filed a deed rider on it 17 years ago, and it is here now, and I am not selling it. Vesper's hand did not move. Fern kept talking, not fast, not loud, but steady. I have got 116 slabs under the shed. I have got 11 walnut butt logs on the skids. I have got a citation from Colston Truett in the drawer that is not going to hold. I have got a deed rider from 1971 that is going to make sure of that. And I have got a stack of firewood on the driveway that is paying for the propane. And I don't have a plan that looks like a plan from Louisville, but I have got a plan. She took a breath. And I would rather lose it doing what I know is right than sell it doing what you know is easy. She said it quiet. She said it kind. She said it the way Everett had taught her to say hard things, which was to say them once plainly without heat and then to stop. Vesper's hand stayed on hers a moment longer. Then Vesper took her hand back. She looked at the folder on the table. She closed it slowly. She put it back in the bag. She did not argue. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice either. That is not what women in that family did. She just sat there a moment with the coffee going cold in front of her. Then she said, I'll leave the realtor's card on the counter. All right. If you change your mind. Yes, ma'am. I love you, Fern. I love you too. Vesper stood up. She smoothed her coat. She picked up her handbag. She stopped at the door. She turned back. "He wouldn't have wanted this for you," she said, softly, kindly, meaning every word. Fern looked at her from the table. "He gave me this," she said. "That's the difference between what he wanted and what you think he wanted." Vesper stood at the door a long moment. Then she nodded once and she went out. The Oldsmobile backed out of the drive at 10:37. Fern watched it go. She sat at the kitchen table with the coffee cooling in front of her, and she looked at the manila folder Vesper had not taken, and the realtor's card underneath it, and the 11 notebooks in the Sunbeam bread box. She sat there a long while. Then she got up. She walked to the front room where the wood stove was. She opened the door of the stove. She stood there a moment with the door open and the heat coming out at her face. She walked back to the kitchen. She took the loan letter out of the drawer. She had had it in that drawer since January. She walked back to the wood stove. She stood there with the letter in her right hand. She thought about a man in tan dress boots who had told her that some ground was never meant to carry anybody. She thought about a bank in Somerset that had already offered a shell company $46,000 for a piece of ground her great-grandfather had bought with a wagon and a mule in 1891. She thought about a paralegal from Louisville who had driven 3 hours in low-heeled Sunday shoes to save her from a life the paralegal had already decided was too hard. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about Deacon. She thought about the man buried under the walnut fence line she had never met and only ever heard laughter of when Everett would tell a story on the porch in the summer and stop halfway through because he had forgotten Deacon was gone. She thought about paper remembers longer than people do. She fed the letter into the stove corner first. $40,000 at 6.8%. Loan applications burned clean. Thin stock, no gloss. The corner curled orange. The heat took the middle. The signature line blank went last. She stood there in the canvas jacket with her arms crossed and the ponytail loose against her back, and she watched a rope with her own land tied to the end of it turn to curl and smoke and go out. She closed the door of the stove. She stood there a moment. Then she walked to the counter and picked up Yvonne Presley's business card. She turned it over in her fingers. She fed it into the stove, too. She closed the door. She went to the kitchen. She turned off the bulb. She stood at the sink in the dark with her hands on the edge of the counter, and she looked out the window over the yard toward the shed. The wind moved in the sycamores. The shed stood. Somewhere out past the pond, a screech owl called once and did not call again. She stood there a long moment. Then she said out loud into the dark to nobody at all, "All right." She got her jacket. She got a flashlight. She walked out to the shed. She stood in front of the stack. She pushed the pins of the moisture meter into the third slab from the bottom. She held the flashlight on the needle. 31%, down from 42 3 weeks earlier. She wrote it in the ledger. She wrote the date. She wrote the temperature. She wrote the wind. Then she wrote one line underneath, in her own hand, in pencil, pressing hard the way Everett had. Ends are holding. Center coming down. Stack is working. She closed the ledger. She stood there a long moment in the dark of the shed with the flashlight in her hand, and she looked at 116 slabs of end-sealed hardwood breathing quietly on the concrete pad. Then she looked up at the top shelf. The walnut box sat where she had left it. Small brass padlock on the front. The dust had settled on the top of it. She had wiped it once in December. She stepped up on the milk crate. She took the box down. She held it in both hands under the flashlight. She felt a small shift inside. Not heavy, not liquid. Something like a small book in a smaller thing beside it. She thought about it a long moment. Then she set it back on the shelf. Not yet. She had burned a loan and turned down a realtor. She had not sold anything. She had not built a market. She had not proven to anybody but herself that the stack was going to come out of the wax in the wind at 8%, and true and flat and worth what she said it was worth. She was not going to open a box her grandfather had built for the whole job when she had done half a job. She stepped down off the milk crate. She turned the flashlight off. She closed the shed door. She walked back to the house through the dark. 2 nights later, the phone rang at 4:17 in the morning. Fern was asleep in the flannel on the couch by the wood stove because the bedroom was too cold. She got up and stumbled to the phone in her socks. Locklear. Fern, it's Lorraine. Lorraine Beckett. The chipped enamel mug. The mustard yellow vest. The widow 4 ridges over. Yes, ma'am. Barrett Halston's boy called me 20 minutes ago. Barrett went out to the porch to bring in the kindling around midnight, and he fell on the ice. His hip. They took him down to the emergency room in Berea. He's asking for somebody to feed the dogs. Fern was already reaching for her boots. How many dogs? 3. Blue tick coon dogs. They're in the kennel behind the house. Feeds in a metal bin on the porch. 2 scoops each. He said the water bucket froze, so it'll need broken up. I'll go now. Take your grandfather's flashlight. The bulb in his porch light burned out in November and he hadn't fixed it. Yes, ma'am. She hung up. She drove the 4 miles up Route 461 at 4:30 in the morning with the heater blowing on the windshield and the flashlight in her lap. Barrett Halston's house was a 2-story board and batten with a porch running the whole east side and a set of split-rail fences that had been there longer than she had been alive. She parked in the drive. She got out. She went around to the kennel behind the house. 3 blue tick coon dogs, half asleep. They knew a stranger. They knew a stranger who moved without hurry. They stood up in the straw. They watched her. She fed them. She broke the ice in the water bucket with the butt of the flashlight. She refilled it from the pump on the side of the house that Barrett had wrapped in heat tape. She went back to the porch. The kindling box was full. He had gotten most of it inside before he fell. The keys to the truck were on a hook by the door. She let herself in and put the coffee on for whoever came in the morning to look after the place. She fed the wood stove. She sat at his kitchen table for a moment. There were 3 notebooks on the table, spiral bound, feed store cheap, blue covers, and on top of them, a brass folding rule initials, BH, stamped into the end plate worn nearly smooth by 50 years of thumbs. She looked at the notebooks a long moment. She did not open them. She went home. She got there at 6:10. The sun was coming up over the pin oaks along the driveway. She stood in the yard a moment with the flashlight in her hand, and she thought about Barrett Halston's rule laid across 3 notebooks on a kitchen table in a house that had gone quiet at midnight. And she thought about Everett Locklear's rule clipped to her own belt loop right at that moment. And she thought about the fact that in Rockcastle County, Kentucky in 1988 at 6:10 in the morning, on the 4th of March, there were exactly 2 brass folding rules that mattered to the story she was in the middle of, and one of them had just gone silent on a porch in the ice. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table. She opened the second notebook. She turned to a fresh page and she wrote in her own hand in pencil, pressing hard the way Everett had. Barrett Halston fell tonight. Hip, Berea. 24-year-old girl and a 71-year-old Sawyer, and neither one of them has said one word about Walnut to the other. There is time. Do the work. She closed the notebook. She looked out the kitchen window at the shed roof under the pale March sun. Somewhere down the driveway, one of the pin oaks dropped a small piece of ice off a branch, and it clicked twice on the gravel, and it was quiet again. She got up, she put the coffee on, she went out to the shed to check the moisture meter. She had 116 slabs on a concrete pad, 16 months to go. On the way to citation in the drawer that was not going to hold a realtor's card, in the ash of the wood stove, a loan letter in the ash beside it, and a walnut box on the top shelf of the shed with a brass padlock on the front, and no key that she was ready to use yet. And in the front room of a house 4 ridges over a 71-year-old man was in a hospital in Berea with a broken hip, and his 3 coon dogs were fed, and the coffee was on for whoever came in the morning. The wind moved in the sycamores along Skaggs Creek. The stack breathed, and Rockcastle County, Kentucky in the first week of March in 1988 kept doing what a Kentucky county does in the first week of March, which is nothing that looks like anything, which is everything at once. Barrett Halston came home from the hospital in Berea on a Friday in the 3rd week of March with a titanium hip pinned into the bone and a cane he was already refusing to use. His son drove him up the hill from Berea in a Ford pickup with the passenger seat leaned back. He helped the old man onto the porch. He set the cane against the porch rail. He said something to his father that Fern could not hear from the fence line, where she stood with a bag of dog food in her arms because she had been feeding the blue ticks for 11 days. Barrett waved her over. She came up the porch steps. She set the bag down on the boards. He looked at her. He looked at the 3 blue ticks in the kennel which were standing at the wire tails going. He looked at the bag of dog food. He did not say thank you. He said, "You come back Sunday. I want to look at your stack." That was the whole conversation. She drove home. Sunday she picked him up at 1 o'clock. He came down the porch steps without the cane, which was against doctor's orders. He got in the truck with his teeth set against the pane and did not mention it. She drove the 4 miles back down Route 461 at 25 miles an hour because the frost was still on the low spots and she did not want him bouncing. They pulled into her driveway at 120. He got out slow. He looked at the shed. He walked to the shed without her. He stopped at the edge of the concrete pad. He stood there a long time. He walked the length of the stack. He walked back. He looked at the stickers. He crouched, which cost him something, and he looked at the alignment of the sticker columns from ground level. He stood back up. He walked to the end of the stack and put his hand flat on the end grain of the top slab where the paraffin had gone on in October. He held his hand there a moment. He rapped his knuckle against the end grain. The wood answered short, bright, a note that hung about a half-second in the March air. He rapped it again. He turned to Fern. He said, "Where is your meter?" She got it out of the coat pocket. He took it from her. He pushed the pins into the 3rd slab from the bottom. He held the gauge to the light. He read the number without moving his lips. He wrote the number in the ledger himself. She had left the ledger on top of the stack because she had been out here at 7 that morning. He handed her the meter back. He said, "You are going to lose the top 2 slabs on this stack, not to checking. To sunburn, you need a second layer of tin over the south-facing edge or the top course is going to case harden in June. I have got a roll of sheet in my barn I will bring over." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You are going to want to move the stack off this pad before the middle of April. The concrete is going to hold summer heat under the bottom course, and the moisture is going to run backward into the wood. Get the whole thing up on treated 4x4s, 10 inches of air under it, or you are going to bloom mold on the underside and never see it until you plane." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "How many butt logs do you have on the skids?" 11. Walnut, "Yes, sir." "How long were they in the water?" "The oldest is 42 years. Some of them are 20. He turned and looked at her a long moment. "You know what you have got?" "Yes, sir." He nodded once. He said, "I will be back Thursday with the tin. I will come at 7. Do not feed me lunch. I do not want to fuss." That was the whole conversation. She drove him home at 3:15. He went inside without the cane. She drove back down Route 461 with her hands loose on the wheel and the pin oaks along the road going by in the pale afternoon light, and something in her chest gone loose that had been tight for 11 months. Because Barrett Halston had spent 40 years feeding hardwood into a mill, and he had walked the length of her stack and told her exactly 2 things she needed to fix. And he had asked her one question she could answer. "You know what you have got?" "Yes, sir." He had come back Thursday. He had brought the tin. He had helped her lay the second course over the south edge. He had not gone up the ladder past the second step because his hip would not let him. She had gone up. He had handed the sheets up to her one at a time. He had cut them to length with her tin snips because she did not own a set of shears. He had said one thing that whole day. He had said it at 11:45 while she was screwing down the last sheet on the ridgeline. He had said, "Your granddad would have done it just like this." She had stopped with the drill in her hand. She had looked down at him from the ridge. He had looked back up. He had said, "Except he would have used 2 more inches of overhang on the north corner. I would." Then he had turned and walked to the truck. Fern would think about that day for the rest of her life. Not because Barrett Halston had helped her lay tin, and not because he had asked the only question that mattered and had gotten the answer she had earned, But because in the space of one Thursday morning in Rockcastle County, Kentucky in 1988, she had gone from a girl standing alone at the fence line with a draw knife in her hand to a woman who had been seen at her work by a man who knew what the work was. That is the whole difference. And nobody at the co-op knew a thing about it. Word moves in a small county the way word moves in a small county, not through a newspaper, through a man telling another man over a fence in the last hour of daylight. Barrett Halston did not tell anybody. But Barrett Halston had gone to the feed store in Livingston 2 Fridays later and had bought a spool of number 9 wire and a set of hinge pins, and he had stood at the counter while Wendell Crow was buying a bag of dog food, and Wendell had said loud enough for the counterman to hear, "How is the girl making out with her rot pile?" Barrett had not answered fast. He had paid for the wire and the pins. He had put his change in his coat pocket. He had walked to the door. At the door, he had turned back. He had said, "It is not a rot pile, Wendell." That was all he had said. He had gone out. Wendell Crow stood at the counter with the bag of dog food on his shoulder and a look on his face like a man who has just been slapped without knowing why. The counterman had rung up the dog food without meeting his eyes. Wendell had paid. He had gone out. 2 nights later, Wendell had driven up Ferns Lane at 5:30 in the afternoon with a cherry log in the bed of his truck. He had not knocked. He had stood at the fence line with his cap in his hand. Fern had come off the porch in the canvas jacket. He had jerked his head at the truck. He had said, "Cherry came down across my hog wire in the last blow. Cattle got out. Took me half a day. You want it. It is yours. I would take it as a favor if you got it off my property." Fern had looked at the log, 15 inches at the butt, 32 feet long, live sawn. She had looked at Wendell. Wendell had not apologized. He had not mentioned the sandbox. He had not brought up the girl playing with rotten sticks that he had told the feed store about in October of '87 and had told the church about in November. He had said, "I got no use for it. You got a saw. That is the whole business." Fern had said, "Yes, sir, I will come pull it tomorrow with the come along." Wendell had nodded once. He had gotten in his truck. He had backed down the lane. That was the whole conversation. That was the second Wednesday of April, 1988. 10 days later, a station wagon with North Carolina plates came up her gravel. Now here is what had happened in the 57 days between when Fern had mailed the 22 samples out of the Livingston post office and when the station wagon came up her lane. She had waited. She had checked the mailbox at 4 every afternoon. She had gotten nothing. Then she had gotten the 2 return packages, undeliverable, that she had left on the kitchen table for a week without opening. Then she had gotten a polite letter from a shop in Winston-Salem that said, "Figured Walnut presents finishing challenges our clientele does not appreciate," which is a $16 way of saying a man does not want to learn something new. She had pinned the letter to the shed post. She had gone back to work. She had heard nothing else for 6 weeks. Then on the 11th of June, the phone had rung at 10:07 in the morning. Fern had been at the kitchen sink with her hands in dishwater. She had picked up on the 4th ring. Locklear. "Ma'am, my name is Rafferty Mont. I am calling from Asheville, North Carolina. I make instruments. I got a wood sample from you in the mail 6 weeks ago." She had stood there at the sink a moment with the receiver pressed to her ear. She had heard him breathing. She had heard a plane going over somewhere in Asheville. She had said, "Yes, sir." He had said, "Ma'am, I chipped it. I planed it. I looked at the end grain under a jeweler's loop. I looked at the ray pattern under raking light. I put it under a stereoscope." He had paused. He had said, "How long was this log in the water?" She had said, "The one that piece came off of. 22 years. It is one of the ones on the sill of the West Bend where the railroad grade backs up in a wet spring." He had said, 22 years. "Yes, sir." "In a creek." "Yes, sir. Skaggs Creek, Rockcastle County, Kentucky." He had been quiet on the line for a long moment. Then he had said, "Ma'am, I have been building guitars for 31 years. I have looked at close to 11,000 board feet of walnut in that time. I have paid $9 a board foot to a mill in Pennsylvania for walnut I did not like as much as this sample." He had paused again. He had said one thing. He had said it easy, the way a man says a phrase that is common in his line of work, but that Fern had never heard not once in her life. He had said river cured. She had held the receiver a moment. She had said, say that again. River cured, sunk timber, wood that has been down long enough for the tannins to leach and the color to go through to the heart. Everybody in the fine furniture trade knows about it. Nobody can get it. It is in a river. He had waited. He had said, ma'am, how many logs do you have? She had said, 11 walnut. 40 of the rest is white oak and cherry and 1 butternut. He had said, I will buy a piece from every log at your price today, and I will call you every 4 months for the next 5 years until you tell me you do not have any more. Fern had stood at the kitchen sink with the receiver against her ear and the dishwater going cold on her hands, and she had said, yes, sir. He had said, what is your price? She had said, send me a piece of your last invoice from your Pennsylvania supplier, and I will price mine off yours. He had laughed once. Short. He had said, ma'am, you are going to do very well. She had said, yes. He had said, I will drive out. Yes, sir. 12 days. Yes, sir. He had hung up. She had put the receiver back on the wall handset. She had stood at the sink a moment. Then she had walked out to the shed and she had stood in front of the walnut box on the top shelf. She had not taken it down. Not yet. She had said out loud into the dark of the shed, I hear you. I am not done. Rafferty Mont came up her gravel in a 1979 Ford Country Squire station wagon with the panel siding gone gray and North Carolina plates on it, in a tailgate that opened flat like a table. He was a small, quiet man in his early 50s in a corduroy jacket and worn boots. He did not shake hands. I walked straight past Fern without a word of small talk and stopped under the tin roof of the drying shed. He stood there a long time. Fern stood beside him, square-shouldered, hands loose at her sides. The brass folding rule clipped to her belt loop catching the June light. He said, do you know what this is? It was not a question, and then when she did not answer it, became one. He said, do you know what this is? She said, air-dried river recovered walnut, sealed the day it came off the saw, 20 months out, bottom rack is at 9.5% center. He looked at her. He said, you measured that? She said, every Sunday. He nodded slow. He said, how many slabs? 116 off the first cut. 92 of them survived the wait. The other 24 checked out worse than I could patch. They are in the firewood pile. He said 92. He walked the length of the stack. He touched the end grain of every course. He got a folding rule out of his coat pocket. It was a small hardwood ruler with a brass hinge. He measured the thickness of one board. He wrote the number on a small notepad he took out of his breast pocket. He picked up a chunk of scrap she had saved for him. He held it under the June light. He turned it. He held it near his eye. He said, there is figure on 19 of these. She said, 22. There is quilt on 3 you cannot see from this angle. He looked at her. He nodded once. He said, I will take 23 today. I will pay you $380 apiece. Cash. I have got the money in the car. I will send you a purchase order for another 42 pieces I want held for me under this roof for the next 4 months. Down payment will hit your mailbox on Tuesday. Fern did not do the arithmetic in her head fast enough to answer. 23 at 380 was 8,740. She said, yes, sir. He said, ma'am, I want you to hear me. This wood is going to build me a run of instruments I have been trying to build for 11 years and could not, because I could not get material. You are going to hear from other builders. When you do, do not sell them anything at that price. Sell them at twice that. She said, yes, sir. He said, you listening? Yes, sir, twice. He nodded again. He walked back to the station wagon. He came back with a canvas bank bag. He counted the money out on the concrete pad. 23 stacks of hundreds. He handed her the bag. He said, load them. They loaded them. He drove. She stood in the gravel with a canvas bank bag in her hand for $8,740. She did not spend it. She drove to First Federal in Somerset the next morning. She opened a business account under Locklear Salvage Hardwoods. The teller counted the cash twice. She wrote a deposit slip. She kept out $100 in 20s for the propane tank and the phone bill and the seed corn she was going to plant in the small field behind the house because Everett had always kept an eighth of an acre in dent corn, and she was going to too. She drove home. She sat at the kitchen table. She sat there a long while. Then she went out to the shed. She stood in front of the walnut box. She looked at it a long moment. She did not take it down, not yet, because a purchase order is not a business, and one buyer is not a market. And she had learned over a long winter with a wax pot and a moisture meter and a citation in her drawer that patience is a discipline you do not break just because a station wagon has come up your driveway. She stepped back from the shelf. She turned off the bulb. She closed the shed door. She went to work. Now here is the part that ought to make anybody who has ever tried to build something out of nothing sit up and pay attention. The next 14 months look like nothing. They look from the road exactly like the 18 months before them. Fern walking the stack every Sunday with the moisture meter. Fern splitting firewood along the driveway. Fern lifting the tin at the end of each week to check for mold under the bottom course. Fern driving into Somerset once a month to deposit checks. Fern reading the notebooks in the evening under the 60-watt bulb. Fern sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open, filling in the columns. What is not visible from the road is that in that 14 months, 22 other builders called. They called because Rafferty Mont told them to. Rafferty was in a small trade that talked to itself. He told a builder in Boston, and a builder in Boston told a builder in San Francisco, and a builder in San Francisco told a shop in Chicago that made high-end furniture for men who had made money in the bond markets and needed something to put in their front rooms. Fern answered every call in the same voice. She quoted every price at twice the number Rafferty had told her to quote because Rafferty had told her to. She sold 61 slabs by June of 1989. She grossed $27,400. She banked $26,000. She spent $1,400 on propane, on the truck, on a used bandsaw wheel to replace the 20-inch that was starting to wobble, on a pair of leather work gloves for herself because her hands had started cracking so bad in the winter that she was leaving blood on the paraffin brush. She did not build the solar kiln that first summer. Barrett Halston had told her not to. He had said, do not scale until the second buyer is a big one. Sell what you have got. Learn the pattern of how these boys buy. Then you will know what to build. She listened. By the fall of '89, Barrett was driving up the lane at 7 in the morning 3 days a week. He would not take a wage. She paid him in beef because a widow 4 ridges south of Livingston had 5 head. She needed to move, and Fern bought the whole lot for freezer meat at 40 cents a pound. Barrett took a quarter every 8 weeks. That was the whole payment. He was 72 by then. He walked with a limp that got worse in the cold. He carried his own coffee. He said very little. But he stood at the edge of the concrete pad on the morning of the first Tuesday in October 1989, and he watched Fern crank the come-along on a walnut butt log up out of the mud on the west bend of the creek. And when she got the log up onto the skid, he walked over and he put his hand flat on the end grain, and he stood there a long time. He said, "This one is 100 years old." She said, "Yes, sir. I found the age ring on the small end, 97. He said, "You need to charge 400 a slab off this log, not 380, 400. She said, "Yes, sir." That was the whole conversation. The solar kiln went up in the summer of '90. She built it against the south wall of the barn. 16 feet of glazing recovered from a torn-down greenhouse on the property of a retired school teacher in Mount Vernon. 2 sliding glass doors from a demolished motel on Route 25 North. Black painted sheet steel inside as the absorber. A box fan wired to a car battery to move air across the stacks instead of letting it stratify. A solar kiln, the kind the Forest Service had been publishing plans for since the '70s. Built by a 26-year-old woman who had never taken a class in anything. It worked beautifully for 11 days. Then July arrived, and it worked too well. She opened the door on a stack of 240 of her best rift sawn boards on the 12th day and found the ends checked. And when she cut a sample cross-section and pried it, the inside opened like a honeycomb. Internal voids, cell collapse, the whole interior torn apart while the surface looked flawless. She had driven the shell dry and hard while the core was still wet, and the core trying to shrink had ripped itself to pieces inside a case-hardened crust. 240 boards, about $4,000 gone in 11 days of sunshine. She sat on the kiln step in the dark that night, and she did not cry and she did not quit. She went inside. She read the 11 notebooks. She was not looking for a formula. She had the formula. She was looking for the sentence. She found it in the second notebook, on a page dated August 1966, in Everett's cramped block letters. You cannot dry wood faster than it wants to go. You can only stop being in its way. She sat with that a long time. Then she rebuilt. She added a damper, a hinged vent at the ridge, and a matching intake low on the north side adjustable by a stick with notches cut in it. She rigged shade cloth on rollers for the hottest 4 hours of the day, and she made herself a test she could trust with her own eyes. Strips of muslin, 4 inches long, tacked at the intake and the exhaust. If both fluttered steady and equal air was moving through the load. If the exhaust strip hung dead, she was cooking, not drying. Every morning at 6 before coffee, Fern stood at the kiln door in the canvas jacket and watched 2 strips of cloth. The second load came out at 8% flat. No honeycomb, no checking. She planed one board. The ray fleck came up like frost. And down at the fence line, something shifted. Nobody said sorry. Nobody ever does. The jokes about the girl with the rot pile just stopped the way a radio stops between stations. And men who used to drive past slow started driving past normal. Then in the third week of October of 1990, a furniture cooperative in Berea called. Not a shop, a cooperative. 14 builders. They wanted a standing quarterly order. 600 board feet of quarter-sawn white oak kiln dry delivered. She said yes. The truck came up her lane on a Tuesday in October, and this time it slowed before it reached the gate. Same rimless glasses, same silver hair parted like it had been measured with a rule, same military straight spine, chin up like he was still the tallest thing in the county. But the aluminum clipboard was not under his arm. Colston Truitt had it down at his side, dangling. And in his other hand, and this is not made up for the poetry of it, was his hat, held against his belt, like a man at a funeral who is not sure whose funeral it is. Fern was at the drying stacks when he pulled in, sighting down a walnut slab with the brass folding rule open in her hand. Everett's initials worn shiny where her thumb sat. She did not put it down. She did not walk toward him. She let him cross the gravel, all 60 yards of it, in those polished tan dress boots that had never once in 3.5 years been the right footwear for this property. Miss Locklear, not sweetheart, not honey, just her name. Funny how fast a man's vocabulary improves when the numbers stop working for him. Here is what had happened to Colston Truitt in the 31 months since he had stood in that same spot and told a 24-year-old woman that she was welcome to the mess. That hauling was $75 a ton, and he would be back when she came to her senses. The spring floods had come again, twice. And every time the creeks jumped their banks, the county ended up with the same problem in a different place. Log jams, root wads, whole sycamores wedged under bridges, orchard trees torn out by the collar and stacked like kindling against culverts. 4 properties now. The Denning Tract, the old fairground bottom, 2 miles of the Whitlow Bank, and Colston's whole professional life had been built on one simple arithmetic. Wood in the water is a liability, and a liability has a disposal fee attached to it. Except now there was a woman 11 miles from his office shipping quarter-sawn river, recovered white oak to a Kentucky furniture cooperative on a standing quarterly order. And the county commissioners had started asking him politely, the way they do right before they don't renew a contract, whether the material he had been burning and burying for 11 years might possibly have had a value on it. He did not know. That is the whole thing. He genuinely did not know. He had spent his career hauling wood without ever once learning to read it. Could not tell a sinker log from a punky one. Could not tell you which cherry butt was worth $6 a board foot and which one was firewood with delusions. He had a printed fee schedule where his knowledge should have been. He looked at her a moment. He shifted his weight. He said, "I have got debris on 4 sites." He stopped. You could hear him choosing a word that would not cost him anything. He said, "I do not have the expertise to grade it." There it was. He asked if she would come look. He asked if she would sort. He asked what she charged. And there was a small, sick hopefulness in it, like a man hoping the number would be small enough to keep his pride in one piece. Fern folded the brass rule shut. Click. She said, "I'll need a receipt." 4 words. That was what she gave him. Not a lecture. Not a single reference to the day he had laughed at her over the hood of that truck and told her that pulling junk out of a creek was a hobby for people who could not afford a real job. Not one word about the $75 disposal fee he had tried to charge her for the privilege of taking his problem away. She just laid out terms. She would not consult. She would not be paid by the hour to make him look competent in front of commissioners. She would buy $10 a ton, site graded by her on her walk through. No negotiation on the grade. And anything she passed on stayed his problem at his own fee schedule. Written receipt for every load. Both signatures dated. Colston did the math out loud badly and then stopped because $10 a ton coming in was better than $75 going out. And the difference across 4 sites was somewhere north of $40,000 a year in fees. He suddenly did not have to justify to anybody. He said yes. Of course he said yes. He had built a whole career on being the only man with a price, and she had taken that away from him with a folding rule and a receipt book. He did not shake her hand. He put his hat back on. He walked to the truck. He got in. He backed down the lane. He drove. His taillights bled once at the bend and disappeared. That was how it ended with a man like Colston Truitt. No shouting, no slam door, just an aluminum clipboard riding shotgun and a pickup backing out of a gravel lot in the late afternoon. Fern turned back to the stack. She read the muslin. She wrote the numbers down. The phone started ringing after that. And this is the part that ought to make an old man smile. Wendell Crow, who had told the feed store in October of '87 that Fern Locklear was playing with rotten sticks like a kid in a sandbox. He called about a walnut that had come down across his fence in the November wind of '91. Did not apologize. Did not mention the sandbox. Just said, "You want it. It is yours. And I would take it as a favor if you got it off my wire." Then the Halloran place called. About a black walnut in the old orchard dying from the top. 42 inches at the butt. Planted by somebody's great-grandfather in the 1890s. They did not ask for money. They asked her to come look. That is how it goes around here. Nobody says sorry. They just start handing you things. By the winter of '92, Fern was running 2 drying sheds, 1 solar kiln, and a mill that was cutting 340 board feet a day. She hired her first full-time hand that spring. A man out of Livingston named Merle Ashworth, who was 34 years old and had been laid off from the crushed stone quarry when it had closed in '91. He worked 6 years. He was a steady man. He never once asked why she measured every board twice. He left in '98 to run a mill of his own down in Pulaski County on land his wife's father had left him. Fern gave him a folding rule at the going-away supper. Not Everett's. A new one ordered from a catalog in Ohio, initials M.A. stamped into the end plate. He took it. He said one thing. He said, "Ma'am, I learned everything I know here." Fern said, "You learned some of it. The rest you brought." That was the whole conversation. By the time Fern was 37 in 1999, Locklear Salvage Hardwoods was shipping to Asheville, Berea, Boston, San Francisco, Chicago, and 2 guitar builders in Osaka. She was clearing $140,000 a year gross. She had put the barn back to true. She had run new electric to the shed. She had bought the 12 acres between her North Hill and the Sinclair property when the Sinclair widow had gone into a nursing home. She had never taken a bank loan. She had married a man named Rowan Ashworth in '95, a mechanic from Berea whose family had been on the same road for 4 generations. Cousin to Merle, though they had not known that when Merle came up the lane looking for work. Rowan worked at his own shop 3 days a week and helped her on the mill 3 days a week. They had a daughter in the summer of '99. She named the girl Everett after her grandfather. The girl had his squared-off block letters by the time she was 7, and Fern would find shopping lists in the kitchen written in a small hand that said milk, eggs, bacon oil, and would stop and lean on the counter with her hand over her mouth. By 2000, the county quietly stopped charging the disposal fee entirely. There stopped being anything to dispose of. The salvage yards got there first, and a system that has nothing to haul away has nothing to bill for. Colston Truitt was not fired. Nobody yelled at him. I was simply, over the course of about 6 years, made irrelevant, which for a man who had once stood in her yard with his thumbs hooked in his belt and told her that she was a girl with a dead man's junk pile and no education, and the county did not negotiate with people like her. That was the good ending. He got to watch slowly with a clipboard he no longer needed. She kept the original citation from March of 1988 on the wall of the office above her workbench, in a black frame, 9 by 12 inches, his signature at the bottom in ballpoint pressed hard enough to emboss the paper. She kept it because it was funny. That is the only reason. Barrett Halston died in the fall of 1996, 80 years old. His son called her at 7:40 in the evening. She drove down to the house in Berea the next morning. She sat with the family in the front room for an hour. She did not say much. She had learned that from him. At the graveside 2 days later, she was one of 6 pallbearers. The other 5 were his son and 3 of his grandsons, and a man she did not know who had cut Walnut with him in Pulaski County in the summer of 1959. She was 33 years old. She was the only woman at the coffin. His son handed her a wooden box after the service. Inside were 3 spiral-bound notebooks, blue covers, and Barrett's brass folding rule with the initials BH stamped into the end plate, worn nearly smooth by 50 years of thumbs. The son said, "He told me to give you these." Fern nodded once. She did not open the notebooks at the graveside. She waited until she got home. She sat at the kitchen table in the canvas jacket and read all 3 straight through in one sitting. They were mostly killing notes, board foot tallies, drying schedules, a joint drawing on page 91 that Barrett had never gotten to build. On the inside back cover of the last notebook, in an unsteady hand, dated the previous November, was one sentence. The girl was right. Just that. She sat there a long time. Lorraine Beckett died 4 winters after Barrett. Her chipped enamel mug sits on the shelf by the door of the office at the mill. Nobody moves it. She hired Cade Beckett in the spring of 2005. Cade was 20 years old that spring, Sylvia Beckett's boy, Lorraine's grandnephew. He had grown up on the road 4 ridges over and had been in Fern's yard as a child at cookouts and at funerals, and had heard the story of the flood, the way a child hears a story that has been in the county before he was old enough to understand what a county was. He had graduated the community college in Somerset that December. He had applied to 2 jobs, both in town. He had turned both down. He had come up the lane on a Tuesday in April in a canvas coat that was too new, with a toolbox in one hand. Fern came off the porch. She said, "Your aunt says you have been asking about a job." "Yes, ma'am." "You know anything about hardwood?" "No, ma'am." "All right." That was the interview. He started that morning. I had grain dust and sawdust in his hair by 7 every morning. He had stopped asking what the meter said in his second week. He worked clean. He had asked one Sunday evening in October of '06 whether Fern would consider teaching him what she knew. She had looked at him a long moment. She had said, "Cade, what I know is not something a person teaches. It is something a person does in front of another person for a long time. I have been doing it in front of you for 18 months. You have been watching. That is the whole lesson." He had nodded. That was the whole conversation. In the spring of 2007, in the second week of April, when the sycamores along Skaggs Creek were just coming into leaf, and the water was running clear over pale gravel where it used to run brown, Fern Locklear walked from the house across the yard to the mill office at 6:20 in the morning. She was 44 years old that spring. Her medium brown hair had gone through with silver at the temples, in the way that hair does when a woman has spent 20 years watching wood dry and worrying about weather. She still wore it in the loose, low ponytail with the wispy strands at the temples. She still wore the canvas jacket. The one on her back that morning was newer than the one she had worn at 24, but not by much. It had the same cut. She still wore worn red and cream plaid flannel under it. Her medium blue jeans were still dust-worn at the thighs and knees. The brass folding rule of Everett Locklear was still clipped to her belt loop. Barrett Halston's brass rule sat on the shelf beside Lorraine Beckett's mug. Cade Beckett was in the office when she came in. Cade was 22 that spring. He had been working the mill full-time for 2 years and change. He worked clean. Fern came in with the walnut box under her arm. She had gone to the shed at 5 that morning. She had climbed the milk crate. She had brought down the box that had sat on that top shelf since 1972, when Everett had put it there and never once mentioned it. She had cleaned the top with a cloth. She had carried it across the yard. She set the box on the workbench in the office. Cade looked up from a ledger he was totaling. She said, "This was my grandfather's." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "It has been on that shelf since I was 9 years old. I did not know what was in it until I was 26. I have not opened it since. I want you to see it." She took the brass key out of her pocket. The key had lived since 1989 in the crease of the binding of the 8th notebook where Everett had left it. She fitted the key into the padlock. She turned it. Click. She lifted the padlock off the hasp. She opened the lid. Inside were three things. A 4 by 4 inch block of walnut, sealed on all 6 faces with paraffin gone hard and yellow. Everett had cut it in 1972. He had labeled it in pencil on the smallest face. Walnut Burl, West Bend, Skaggs Creek, October 72. A folded sheet of pencil paper. Blocky capitals. Pressed hard. And underneath, both on the bottom of the box, a diagram. She lifted the diagram out first. A kiln, a firebox at the bottom, a plenum, a perforated floor, a stovepipe chimney out the gable, shade cloth on rollers, muslin strips at the intake and the exhaust, and above the ridge drawn careful with a straight edge, a wind-drawn cowl that spun on the prevailing breeze and pulled hot air up the stack without a single electric fan. The exact kiln she had rebuilt in the summer of '90 after the honeycomb collapse. Cade looked at the diagram. He looked at Fern. She said he drew that in October of 1972, 19 years before I built it. Cade did not answer. She picked up the folded paper. She opened it. She read it once to herself. Then she read it out loud because that was what it was for. To whoever finishes, you found the key. That means you read the notebooks. That means you did the work. The block in this box is from a walnut burl I found in the west bend of Skaggs Creek in October of 1972. I cut a sample and sold it to a luthier in Louisville named Winston Kroll for $19. He said the color was better than anything he had ever seen. He said he wanted more. I could not get more. There was no market for one old man's bin. I put the sample here in case. If you are reading this, the market is there. Waste is a decision you make about a thing before you have looked at it twice. What the water keeps the world calls lost. Somebody ought to remember that. Somebody ought to. E.L. She folded the paper. She set it beside the diagram. She picked up the walnut block. She turned it in the light. The paraffin had gone hard. The wood inside was chocolate and rippled and shimmered when she turned her wrist. 35 years old, and it had not moved a hair. She set it back in the box. She looked at Cade. She said, "This is not a gift. It is a job." He did not finish it. I did not either. She unclipped the brass folding rule from her belt loop. She held it in the palm of her hand a moment. The initials E.L., worn shiny at the thumb. She held it out. Cade did not take it. Not for a moment. Then he wiped his hand on the front of his jeans, and he took the rule and he clipped it to his own belt loop where it belonged. He looked at her. He did not thank her. That was the whole conversation. She turned. She walked out of the office. She walked across the yard toward the shed in the April light, with the wind moving in the sycamores and the medium brown grain dust on the shoulders of her canvas jacket and the freckles still across the bridge of her nose from a lifetime of walking rows. Somewhere down the pasture, a mourning dove called once and did not call again. Rockcastle County, Kentucky went about its mourning. She stopped at the shed. She stood in the doorway. The moisture meter sat on the shelf where she had put it in December of '87. The pins were dull from 20 years of use. The needle had been recalibrated once. She left it where it was. She looked up at the top shelf. The shelf was empty for the first time in 35 years. She stood there a long moment. Then she turned. She walked back to the house. The kitchen was warm from the wood stove. Rowan had left the coffee on. Their daughter, Everett Locklear Ashworth, 7 years old that spring, was at the kitchen table in her Sunday shoes, drawing a picture on the back of an envelope. Her hair was medium brown with warm chestnut and sunlight golden undertones, and it was pulled back into a loose, low ponytail with wispy strands falling around her forehead and temples. She looked up when Fern came in. She said, "Mama, I drew you." Fern came over. She looked at the drawing. It was a stick figure of a woman in a jacket, and beside her a stick figure of a girl, and behind them a stack of horizontal lines that a 7-year-old had labeled in careful block letters, "Wood." Fern kissed the top of her daughter's head. She said, "That is a good stack." The girl said, "Is the wood ready?" Fern said, "Some of it. There is more coming." The girl nodded. She went back to her drawing. Fern stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard and the shed and the pin oaks along the driveway. And she thought about a walnut box that had gone off a top shelf that morning after 35 years, and a brass folding rule that was clipped to a young man's belt loop out in the office, and a diagram of a kiln in her grandfather's hand from 1972 that had matched exactly in every detail the kiln she had built with her own hands 19 years later without ever having seen it. She thought about the 3 graves at the top of the North Field, and she thought about the walnut fence line, 42 years in the ground, in 1987, 62 years in the ground, now still standing. And she thought about the sycamores along Skaggs Creek, where the bank swallows were nesting in the cut above the west bend, and the crawfish under the flat stones, and the clear water going over the pale gravel, where 20 years ago the water had been the color of coffee with milk in it. And she thought about the sentence in Everett's hand at the top of the second notebook. "What the water keeps the world calls lost." She had said it 42 times in her life by that April morning in 2007. She would say it again. "Somewhere near you right now there is a pile of something nobody wants. Go look at it twice."